All right, thank you, Randy. And thank you for joining us today to discuss lost grasslands in the Eastern U.S., which is one of our favorite topics. And my name is Brice Hanberry, and I work for the research branch of the U.S. Forest Service at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And I'll be talking about using fire compartments and historical land cover to rediscover grasslands in the Eastern U.S. And then you're in for a special treat because we have a second presentation where Reed Noss will present about the importance of grasslands. And so historically in the Eastern U.S., grasslands with limited tree presence were embedded in a matrix of predominantly open oak and pine forests. So those would be woodlands that you can see through. Most of those grasslands have been converted to land uses or have become forests. So we don't know much about the location and extent of historical Eastern grasslands. We do have good records of the Prairie Peninsula, which was an extension of the Great Plains grasslands into the Eastern U.S., and those grasslands started disappearing during the late 1800s. The Great Plains region and the Prairie Peninsula are pretty flat, and fire was able to spread easily without restrictions when pushed by those strong westerly winds. So I first applied the fire compartment idea to delineate the Great Plains region by using a wind model. And this worked extremely well and actually was consistent for different wind models and over time. That same delineation occurred during formation of the Great Plains grasslands about 10,000 years ago. That's a different paper, but you're welcome to look into that if you want. And so briefly to define grasslands, they're dominated by herbaceous vegetation with limited tree cover, but they are continuous in phase with savannas, which are continuous with open and closed woodlands, which I call open forests. There's more of a break between open forests and closed forests, and closed forests have trees that dominate the understory and midstory, whereas open forests literally are open. You can see through them, walk through them, and they coexist with an herbaceous ground layer. And so both grasslands and open forests are dependent on frequent surface fire to control tree establishment. So again, grasslands were intermixed within open forests in the Eastern U.S., which in this case, you can see what I'm talking about in the figure there. The intermixing of grasslands and open forests is due to the topography present in the Eastern U.S. And also we should acknowledge the unique nature of longleaf pines in the southeastern coastal plain, which they essentially act as a grass during the vulnerable small diameter tree stage to tolerate frequent surface fires. So if there wasn't a tree species that could tolerate near annual fire regimes, then the coastal plain historically would have been primarily grasslands. For modeling for predictor variables, we use fire proxies of wind speed and topographic roughness to indicate fire compartments where fire can spread. And for grassland samples, we use prairie in the mid-southeastern U.S., primarily Kentucky and Tennessee. And these areas were identified by the Southeastern Grasslands Institute, and they were more comprehensive than the grassland cover in the LANDFIRE BPS. However, LANDFIRE BPS was very handy to use for our non-grassland samples for cover of non-grasslands. So in terms of results, our model predicted potential grassland locations in 27 million hectares, or about 14% of the 200 million hectare study extent that we use for the Eastern U.S. And keep in mind, those potential grassland locations could have been savannas or woodlands, depending on fire frequency. A very simplified, generalized rule set for grasslands was topographic roughness values of less than 95 or flatter sites, and wind speeds greater than or equal to 3.4 meters per second. But, there is an interaction. So say if topography increases, then wind speed would need to increase. Currently, these potential grassland locations are 40% crops, 25% pastures, 18% forests, some developed space, and about 1.5% each of herbaceous upland vegetation and herbaceous wetlands. So based on this, that would mean that about 3% of grasslands remain if you include all marshlands. And this grassland layer is available at the Forest Service Data Archive, or you can feel free to email me at Brice.Hanberry at USDA.gov. So zooming in to look at grassland predictions, they generally match really well in terms of concentrating in well-known grassland locations. So some of those labels like the Black Belt Prairie, and also they concentrated in grasslands identified by the Southeastern Grasslands Institute and LANDFIRE BPS, and that pink color overlays. The pink color would be the grasslands identified by those two different organizations. So grassland and savanna restoration have a lot of benefits. Grassland herbaceous plants are more resistant and resilient to severe fires than forests, as they just by definition don't have the height of trees. They're also resistant and resilient to drought, heat, windstorms, and insect outbreaks compared to current dense closed forests, which may experience periodic massive die-offs under climate change. And grasslands will, of course, support biodiversity of herbaceous plants, pollinators and other insects, birds and bats, and lots of animals considered early successional. So a diversity occurs in the forbs or flowering plants and grasses, which include many more species than the few hundred tree species in the eastern U.S. For example, in addition to endemic plants, species richness of plants on a fine scale in parts of the coastal plain is the greatest recorded in North America and among the greatest in the world. And Reed pointed out in a paper that this southeastern coastal plain region qualifies as a biodiversity hotspot. So the floral resources support pollinators and other insects, which appear to be declining worldwide. And the combination of herbaceous resources and plentiful insects support vertebrates. And with that, please feel free to email me with questions or for setting up a discussion. And Reed, I will stop sharing, and Reed will now share more about grasslands.
I'm going to just following up on what Brice had to say about our study and about our general findings of the potential location of fire-maintained grasslands around the east. I want to focus now a little more on the ecology and biogeography of grasslands in the southeast in particular, because this is the area that has the highest species richness of any of the grassland regions, actually in North America. Slides don't want to advance. There we go. So Southeastern Grasslands Institute, SGI for short, is a little bit, you might say, imperialistic. We take a very broad view of what is the Southeast. We, in fact, use the entire unglaciated eastern United States, with the northern margin determined by the southernmost glacial boundaries of the Pleistocene, and the actual boundaries refined by level 4 EPA ecoregions. The western boundaries are defined more by floristics, with species with more eastern affinities included within our region, and locations with more western affinities are excluded from our study region. Okay. So one of the reasons that the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative was formed and why I wrote a book on this topic a few years ago is that these systems are really high conservation concern. They're among the most species-rich grasslands globally. They're also the most highly imperiled ecosystem in North America, if we look at them as a whole. And just as one example of this, NatureServe recognizes 39 critically endangered ecological systems in North America. And this is using IUCN criteria. Of these, 64% occur in the Southeast, and 56% of those are grasslands. So we're talking about a very high number. We take at SGI a very inclusive definition of grasslands. So all of these types of systems, we include grasslands. Some are treed grasslands, others are treeless grasslands. So prairies, grassy balds, savannas, and woodlands. These would be open woodlands of the type Brice described that have enough openness of the canopy to allow a grassy ground layer. Barrens, glades, outcrops, herbaceous wetlands, and then a very odd system that I won't go into any further today, but canebrakes dominated by American bamboo, arundinaria, which of course is a grass. The Southeastern Coastal Plain in particular was a strongly grassland region. Pine savannas dominated the landscape. They made up about 2/3 of the pre-European settlement landscape in the Southeast. And these, no, not just in the coastal plain actually, but they graded into woodlands all the way up into the southern Blue Ridge and Appalachian plateaus. And this is an example of what a fairly typical old growth longleaf pine wiregrass savanna looks like. This particular tract is one of the most pristine that still remains. We're talking only about 3% of the original distribution of these amazing savannas remains. So if we're interested in maintaining and restoring grasslands in the Southeast or anywhere, it's important to know what kinds of factors were responsible for the creation of these systems in the first place and what maintained them over time. And all of these are important. Fire is in bold here because it was in general the most important. Climate, however, historically was quite important and remains important today in terms of microclimate, as I'll give you a couple of examples, but also substrate, hydrology, herbivores, especially mega herbivores, and a variety of other disturbances and combinations of disturbances help maintain grasslands in the face of tree invasion. And of course, humans modify all of the above. We either increase grassland or decrease grassland depending on our land use. The coastal plain, as I mentioned, is a particularly grassland region, and Florida historically and still today has the most grassland of any state in the East. And this relates to lightning flash intensity, the frequency of lightning. Up until the mid-Holocene, studies show that across the East, lightning was more important than human ignitions until about the mid-Holocene, say about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. More recently, the rest of the East has been primarily ignited by human ignitions, except for the coastal plain, where lightning remained dominant until the time of European settlement. And this is something that's not widely known, actually. And so with all this fire related to all this lightning, you might expect that species would evolve traits to tolerate or even take advantage of fire. And so we call these fire adaptive traits. And in general, adaptive traits are those that provide a fitness advantage in a given environment. And so when we have so many cases, many different families of plants, for example, that show suites of these traits, adaptation to fire is the most parsimonious explanation. But it's important to recognize that species don't adapt to fire per se, but rather to very specific fire regimes, those that they have experienced during their evolutionary histories. So it makes sense that if we change these fire regimes, we're going to have repercussions on the community. One of the best known fire adaptations is thick bark. This is an ancient adaptation. Phylogenetic studies and fossil evidence show us that fire protective thick bark in pines arose in the Cretaceous about 126 million years ago. And then by 89 million years ago, already two alternative adaptive strategies had arisen in Pinus. One characterized by thick bark and branch shedding, which is what we find in a frequent surface fire type regime. And then another type characterized by serotiny, closed cones that open under the heat of fire, and branch retention to actually bring fire up into the canopy. And we see both of those adaptations in various pines today. But it's not just pines. Oaks, many species of oaks, some hickories, a few other trees also have thick fire adaptive bark. Blackjack oak, as shown here, the bark near the base actually comprises more than half of the basal diameter. It then thins out as you go up the tree because you don't need to have thick bark above the typical flame zone. So very interesting adaptation. The pinnacle of adaptation to fire is the ability to actually promote and facilitate fire, pyrogenicity, which is a type of niche construction. And so we have, for example, in the longleaf pine savannas, we have flammable C4 grasses, such as wiregrass, Aristida bayerickiana, but also fallen pine needles. And the pine needles actually increase fire temperatures and duration of heating even more than these herbaceous fuels. One piece of evidence for the antiquity of fire, especially in the coastal plain, is the prevalence of so many endemic taxa that are highly fire adapted. And in fact, in the coastal plain, 85% of all the endemic plants are associated with fire-dependent pine savannas and embedded communities such as depression wetlands. And you can see here, these contour maps are of overlay of plant species restricted to 25 or fewer counties. So these are narrow range or endemic taxa. And you can see they're concentrated in the coastal plain, especially Florida and parts of adjacent states. Florida has more endemic plants than any state except California. If we go out of the coastal plain, we find some very similar communities. This happens to be in the Ouachita Mountains in the Ouachita National Forest of Arkansas. This is a shortleaf pine savanna with some oaks, primarily post and blackjack oak. That's a blackjack oak there in the lower left. They're very similar in their ecology to longleaf pine savannas. And in fact, one thing I find interesting is that they have a lot of the same characteristic animal species. Birds, for example, such as red-cockaded woodpecker and brown-headed nuthatch are dominant species in this community. And moving back down to the south, perhaps the most frequent fire grassland in all of North America is the so-called Florida dry prairie, more accurately called hyperseasonal subtropical grasslands. These historically covered over 1.2 million acres. They're about 90% reduced, mostly by conversion to pasture, but some big blocks remain. This one particular this preserve is over 60,000 acres. You can see this is a very flat landscape. So this brings back what Brice was talking about, large fire compartments. This landscape is very minimally dissected. And so fires, once lit, will spread for many, many miles before they go out. And no surprise, with this very high fire frequency, we've had species that have adapted to this type of fire. The Florida grasshopper sparrow, which is one of the rarest and most endangered birds in North America, less than 200 individuals remaining, about half of those in captivity, requires fire within usually about 18 months of its breeding period in order to breed successfully. There are no known sites where reproduction has occurred that have gone unburned for more than 24 months. But not all grasslands require fire. There's an entire class of grasslands known as Edaphic grasslands, some of which appear to require fire, but others do not. This is an example. There's as much rock here as there is vegetation. This is a granitic flat rock glade in Georgia. Many other kinds of glades exist around the Southeast. These have very sparse, low vegetation. Grasses are typically the dominant herbaceous vegetation, but you have lots of others, such as these succulents you see there in red. That's Diamorpha smallii, by the way, if you're interested in botany. There's other grasslands like the black belt grasslands that Brice showed you on a map. These have very calcareous, shrink-swell clay soils that are inimical to tree establishment. So they tend to favor grasses over trees. However, they do require occasional fire because trees will slowly invade without fire. Similarly, serpentine grasslands. Serpentine soils occur on ultramafic rocks, which are rocks that are very high in magnesium, iron, as well as often nickel, chromium, and other heavy metals that is toxic to many plants. And grasses tend to do better in these serpentine soils than woody vegetation. But still, fire is required because trees will eventually invade these serpentine grasslands in the absence of fire. Now, here's an interesting type that might not require fire. It probably gets some fire because they're in exposed ridgetop locations where you would expect some lightning activity. However, the soils are extremely thin and shaly. And what's really interesting is that they're almost entirely south or southwest facing slopes. So they get the full heat and drying effect of the sun in the afternoon. So it creates a microclimate that is inimical to tree invasion. Another type that has very extreme conditions are saline barrens, which are mostly found in Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. These have extremely alkali soils that are, again, not favorable to trees. And these communities apparently don't even require fire, even occasional fire, to persist in this open grassy condition. And then one of the saddest, but also most interesting examples, the Hempstead Plains grassland. Now, if you remember from that map I showed, the very northeastern portion of the SGI study region is actually the southern half of Long Island, which, amazingly enough, is unglaciated. These Hempstead Plains grasslands occur on a glacial outwash plain south of the terminal moraine of the last couple glaciations. And the soils are very sandy, overlying gravel. So they're exceedingly well drained and xeric, even though that area, of course, gets a fair amount of rain. And dry prairies covered something like 99% of the area, but we also had oak and pine savannas as shown here. So the original extent of these has been estimated by various people as anywhere from 30,000 to 60,000 acres. Only a few acres remain. They're more than 99.99% gone. One of our most endangered ecosystems, probably anywhere in the world. River scour is another way. Flooding, frequent flooding and scouring by water or ice helps maintain grassland vegetation against woody encroachment. This particular example is within the limits of the District of Columbia along the Potomac River. It gets frequent floods every 2.5 to 7 years. And the dominant grasses are the same that you'd find in a typical tall grass prairie. Big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stem, and switchgrass, for example. Then my final topic, just a couple slides here. And this in a way throws a wrench into everything I've been telling you about the importance of fire. Because now it appears from a number of recent studies that at various times in recent history, during the Quaternary, Pleistocene and Holocene, especially up through the Pleistocene, herbivory by mega-herbivores in particular may have been even more important than fire in maintaining these open ecosystems. Some recent studies show that herbivory globally has declined something like 50% since the extinction of the mega-herbivores at the close of the Pleistocene. And several studies on several continents show that right after the extinction of the mega-herbivores, we had a dramatic increase in fire activity. So it's, I think, important to recognize that even though fire is the major force today, maintaining many of these grasslands, herbivory is important as well. And most importantly for biodiversity is probably this combination of herbivory and fire, which maintain the highest biodiversity. Sam Fuhlendorf and his colleagues at Oklahoma State have shown this persuasively in the Southern Great Plains. We haven't had, to my knowledge, anywhere that I can find any really good studies of this pyrrhic herbivory hypothesis in the Southeast. Nevertheless, it's, I think, very likely. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Randy for general discussion and any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Very interesting talk. One of my pet peeves in doing outreach and education is this kind of reliance on this term early successional habitat. And it does not seem like our native coastal plain grasslands are early successional at all. I've read a lot of work by Veldman, and I would just like to have someone talk to the age and the successional stage of these native grasslands. Thank you.
That is an excellent question, because historically ecologists considered the climax forest of the southeastern coastal plain to be a mixed hardwood forest. They did not recognize these pine communities as being a natural state. They thought they were entirely maintained by human burning, and that if burning stopped, they would convert to hardwoods. Now, that much is true. But as I showed with that lightning slide, there was enough fire around, as far as we can tell from the fossil record, for millions of years, that and the herbivores, to maintain these open systems. They're not successional. They're basically non-successional systems. And so they don't mature. They don't go through a series of stages to a climax. They're pretty much the same system from right after a major disturbance to all the way up to full maturity. And so they're, and that's typical of savannas worldwide, really. They're non-successional.
Yeah, succession is just something that's happened in the past 100 years or so since frequent overstory disturbance by humans. Before that, all of these systems are essentially our old growth. There are some rare exceptions, but these are, very stable communities. There are changes that happen, but you don't need to apply anything about succession. If you apply successional concepts to these ecosystems, you're not understanding them correctly. Like these, even the grassland plants can be, hundreds of years old because they're, clones. They go through vegetative reproduction. So the trees are hundreds of years old. The grasses can be decades old, and it's a misunderstanding to apply successional concepts to any kind of historical ecosystem for the most part.
Just to follow up on that, Brice, there's been some recent studies looking at growth rates and underground storage organs and such in some of these forbs in the coastal plain, and estimates are, and subshrubs also, estimates are up to like 10,000 years old for some individual clones for some of these oaks, saw palmetto, etc.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. Like they really, a lot of ecological concepts that are conventional, that are taught in textbooks, you really have to just think of them like, if you hear anything, do the exact opposite, and then that will be the correct way to approach historical ecosystems.
Wow, great. And just a quick anecdote. I remember when we were modeling historical fire regimes for LANDFIRE, I think it blew a lot of people's minds when it was suggested that the fire return interval in Florida for some of these systems would be 1 or 2 years. Like it almost broke the model. It's just like it was so amazing. A couple great questions in the chat that I will call out. And if I mischaracterize your question as I shorten it, jump in or just take yourself off mute if you want. William Hunter notes that he refers to mammoths, mastodons, and really big beaver as contributing to grassland maintenance for potentially thousands of years in the Southeast. Seems wherever fossils for these taxa, as well as ground sloths, horses, etc., would suggest grassland-dominated areas. Thoughts on the validity of these types of statements? Sort of the correlation between those herbivores and grassland domination back in the day.
Actually, that when I was reconstructing the history of grasslands in the Southeast for my book, Forgotten Grasslands of the South, I relied more than anything else on fossil vertebrate evidence. And people like David Webb at the Florida Museum of Natural History have collected a lot of this evidence and have been, through the morphology of the animals, they've been able to associate them with particular habitat types. And so we have a continuity of savanna-adapted vertebrates going back at least to the mid-Miocene. So we're talking maybe, 20 million years ago in the Southeast. And at the time, there was also intermittently from the Miocene up through the Pleistocene, there was also a corridor of savanna and thorn scrub vegetation, apparently, that spread all the way from the Southwest and Mexico eastward to Florida and into parts of adjacent states. It's known as the Gulf Coastal Corridor. And this was David Webb's hypothesis, but it's really well supported by the evidence, both fossil plant evidence as well as the vertebrate evidence.
And I would like to add, deer are considered a forest threat, which is true and a good. We like that aspect of them. In fact, again, it's a thing of we need to really rethink. If deer are a forest threat, that means they're actually a restoration tool for woodlands and grasslands. So you really need to just turn everything in conventional forestry and ecology on its head and think, oh, deer are a forest threat. That's good. That's one of our tools. We actually don't consider deer overabundant. And in fact, we probably don't have enough deer on the landscape for maintain. In fact, we do not have enough large herbivores on the landscape to help maintain, help as a tool to browse, and establishing trees. And one reason why people may be having particular difficulties in restoration is because it's missing that herbivory component, where we used to have, 50 large herbivores, and our last remaining herbivore is deer. So, that may be one of those missing ingredients, and maybe you need to get some goats in there if you're looking at restoration.
In fact, goats are being used in some communities like the grassy bulbs in the Southern Appalachians. And the best hypothesis for the origin and maintenance of those high elevation Southern Appalachian grassy bulbs is that they were grassy tundra during the glacial cycles of the Pleistocene, and they were used seasonally by mega herbivores. And nearby fossil beds show up to like 20 some species of mega herbivores present, and they were known to make seasonal migrations. And then when those died out, we still had bison and elk and deer in the Southern Appalachians. When whites came in early European settlers and wiped out those mega herbivores, we started to lose the bulbs. Except then the settlers started moving their livestock up to graze those systems in the summer, and that helped maintain them. So now livestock are being reintroduced to some of these to help maintain the open bulbs, because those appear to be too cold and wet to have frequent fire. They have rainfall up to 90 to even more, up to even 100 inches a year. So fire was probably very rare on those grassy bulbs.
And thinking about it, fire frequency totally depends on your site quality and your growth rates and your site. So if you have really slow growing ecosystems, fire doesn't need to be very frequent because your tree growth establishment is very slow. So, the more rapid everything moves along, the more frequent your fire needs to be. The slower the ecosystem grows, if it has a short growing season, if it has poor soils, if it has limited precipitation and so forth, fire may need to only get in there every 25 years, every 50 years, even. Just if it moves slowly, the trees are gone slowly. And then for the super nerds among us, interestingly enough, Reed Noss had pointed out that the shale barrens were in the George Washington National Forest. I was looking at seeing if I had a consultation with the George Washington National Forest, and I was looking to see if I could find some historical records about, what was the herbaceous plant community back in the day. And the early botanists, the famous ones like Asa Gray and people like that, did not note the shale barrens, apparently. Of course, they may have just thought, oh, no big deal. But another thought is it was open enough, those shale barrens really didn't stand out and the landscape the way that they do now, because they're just, it was more savannas and woodlands, and those shale barrens they were not those really discrete units that they are now.
I think that's quite possible.
Wow, well, you touched on this a bit. Jason Teets asked, can the domestic cattle herbivory be used as a restoration tool? You touched on that a little bit, but I was curious if you have further comments on that.
Well, I, being kind of a rewilding purist, I would prefer to see bison if it's within the native range of bison. However, when that is impossible for various reasons, livestock managed to mimic bison activity, which means making them move more and stay out of the wetlands, for example, can be a good tool. But it takes a lot more intensive management. Bison typically, they will hang out in riparian areas sometimes. We've all seen that, but they tend to move a lot more distance on a daily or seasonal basis. Their diets are very similar to cattle. There's not much difference in the diets, apparently, but they both respond to fire, and that they come in and graze preferentially on recently burned areas because of the increase in nutrition and palatability. But you do have to manage the cattle pretty intensively to get them to mimic a native herbivore.
And cattle tend to, besides hanging out in the riparian areas, the way that they're stocked usually means that there's just a uniform length that the foliage will grow, like it will be, very short, close to the ground. And with bison and the way that bison are stocked, there will be a lot of diversity and variety in left, like just like fire, where there's a whole mosaic of patterns that occur that with domestic livestock that all gets wiped out and you just have like a stubble.
Yeah, absolutely.
And with that, I have maybe a related question, and then I want to call everyone's attention to a comment by Robert Soames in the chat. I was thinking about LANDFIRE biophysical settings models, and while we tried to capture all historical disturbances, and we cited literature, expert knowledge, local data sets, General Land Office surveys, everything we could for those models, I'm pretty convinced that we underrepresent grazing. And I'm wondering, if you all have played around with any of the LANDFIRE biophysical settings models, and if you've tried increasing native herbivory to match what you think it is, or if you have a paper you can even point me to or the audience to that has either the amount area grazed per year or a return interval or something that we can turn into numbers. And I'll open that up to the whole audience, but especially Reed and Brice.
I don't know if we have that kind of data out there. I did recently publish a paper that is trying to reframe deer as a natural disturbance. And so I go over a lot of the evidence for, we've really downscaled our herbivore community to just, one, and it's not even a very big one. So I go over a lot of the evidence for historical communities, historical populations, again, what the evidence shows for what deer do. And actually, if you turn it on the head, they're browsers. They small diameter trees. That's actually a good thing. I go over the costs and benefits for that. So I did work on a paper recently that establishes deer as a like a framework for thinking of it as a natural disturbance with a range of ecological benefits and socioeconomic outcomes. But in terms of having a data set that can show and so it might be just a matter of you're going to have to play around in your models.
I made the claim in some of my writings that, the mega herbivores were much more abundant than present day large herbivores on the landscape, prior to the early Holocene. It's been criticized by some as being, well, just because there was a high diversity of native herbivores doesn't necessarily equate to a high density of native herbivores. But if I can share my screen just briefly, I have a paper here that I actually referred quickly to during my talk, but it's a recent paper. It does try to estimate densities of mega herbivores, and let me pull it into the center here. And this is on a global scale, so you'd have to really dig in to see what you could find specific to Eastern North America, for example. But this just was published in June of this year. Let's see what paper, the Global Ecology and Biogeography, which is a good journal, and it's a fascinating story. And this is the paper that estimates that herbivory was reduced by about 50% when all of these mega herbivores went extinct in the late Pleistocene. So if you consider that, and that's a lot. It probably was a factor that we need to consider more carefully, especially with the evidence that humans were a major, if not the major factor in the extinctions of these animals. Stop sharing.
I want a quick challenge or a call to action for anyone. If anyone would like to jump on a Zoom and go through LANDFIRE state and transition models and play with disturbance regimes as a way to learn about how we do state and transition modeling and just play with things, as Brice suggests, hit me up via email at rswati@tnc.org and we'll give that a go. I wanted to A couple great comments and a great question in the chat. Karen, thanks for your comment. It was very, very thought-provoking for me. Not just deer alone, though, deer plus predators to keep them on the move. I don't know. I was curious if anyone else had comments on that, but I appreciated that comment, Karen.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I would think that movement's really key. It makes me think of the border collies with the cows, just keeping them on the move.
In fact, in general, I mean, one of the ways that predators regulate their prey is not so much their abundance, but their spatial and temporal distribution. And that's the very important role that they play. They keep them on the move. They keep them out of areas that they're otherwise would concentrate activity and cause some of the harmful effects we see of overbrowsing by deer.
Interesting. Righto. Nathan has a question that I really appreciated. Nathan Delaney. How would restoring these historic grasslands impact carbon stocks in areas where trees have moved in? Does restoring these grasslands increase sequestration rates instead? And that's a great question, because we can get into these biodiversity versus carbon debates. So I would just love your thoughts on this. Again, from anyone, with the spotlight on Brice and Reed, but anyone, appreciate comments on that.
I can start on that. I've done co-authored a couple papers with Joe Veldman, Texas A&M, who's looked into this quite a bit. In general, it's estimated that globally, grasslands store about a third or a little more of carbon, more than was previously thought. And the interesting thing, of course, is that they store their carbon almost entirely below ground. There was a paper in study in California by Das et al., DASS, just a few years ago, that it compared carbon storage and the security of that storage in grasslands versus forests. Since the carbon is below ground in grasslands, it's actually much more secure in the face of increasing disturbance, as Brice mentioned early in her presentation. When we have increasing drought, fire, other major disturbances, the carbon in forests is going to be more likely to be released into the atmosphere, while that in grasslands is securely held below ground. So I think it's really been a mistake that so much of the mitigation strategy for carbon has been to, plant trees, for example, including planting trees in native grasslands, one of the worst possible things you could do. It would be much better to restore native grasslands as the first priority in many cases, not everywhere.
For any trade-off, restoration is the way to go, not afforestation.
Yes.
But in terms of this, again, in terms of dealing with climate change, planting trees is not going to solve the problem. First of all, it is important to keep, to consider that as one of the benefits of having trees, but that's not going to solve the problem. It's a nice solution for everyone, but it's not a solution that works. We found, if you look into the literature, oftentimes the trees that are planted are plantation trees and plantation forestry. They're harvested, and so again, there's that not stable carbon stocks. And if you look at woodlands, because those trees are old growth trees, they have extremely large diameters, and they can carry more above ground biomass than just a conventional closed forest because their diameters are so large, even though the densities are lower. So I have some papers that show that above ground biomass, if you go the woodland restoration route, you can have greater above ground biomass within those large diameter trees at lower densities than you have in those small diameter, high density closed forests that we have right now. And when you do woodland restoration, you get those grassland plants in there. So if you did a longleaf pine woodland restoration, you would be, if carbon was one of your main objectives, you would be getting, equivalent carbon storage as in closed forests, and you would be supporting those grassland plants. Reed likes to consider those longleaf pine woodlands as actually grasslands with some big grassy trees above. So again, planting trees is not the panacea for climate change, but you can get a lot of stable below ground growth with a grassland species. You can get more above ground biomass with large diameter old growth trees. It is true that, when people look at soils, oftentimes those closed forests do have more organic matter in them than in grasslands because, we burn the grasslands and things like that. So if you actually do a soil by soil comparison and actually have a study starting that, it does look like there's more organic matter in those, go up to Minnesota and they have a lot of organic matter in their soils.
The farther south you go in the Northern Hemisphere, though, the grasslands tend to have a lot more of plants with specialized below ground storage organs, which are not easily burned up, and they store a lot of carbon. So it's not just organic matter, soil organic carbon, it's actually held within non-structural carbohydrates in the below ground organs.
Well, so that's really neat. You should probably, if you can find a link to that paper, that sounds very interesting.
Yeah, there's several papers on that.
Okay.
But a couple of my botanist friends say that in North America, Central Florida, for example, is probably the hotspot of below ground storage organs. There's so many of our plants that have these specialized or generalized storage organs.
Wow. Well, I think with one of the reasons I am an ecologist are all the details that just change the story depending on where you are, and it's never one factor, it's always several. And so you all have added a lot of nuance for me on how these systems work. I wanted to call our attention to a couple other things before I throw up the poll. Joe Vaughn asks in the carbon vein about charred wood decomposition versus uncharred wood, wondering about the role of fire and carbon storage relative to the charring. So I just want to call that out. If anyone has comments on that or papers to share, we'd love that.
Oh, charcoal is extremely stable form of carbon. And so charcoal that is produced during a fire is going to be there in the soil or on the ground or underground for a long time. I can't remember specifics on that, but it's impressively high compared to uncharred wood.
Yeah, I feel like in that book, what is it? It's 1491 or whatever, they talked about seeing biochar in the Amazon soils. That natives were using biochar as a soil amendment. Anyway.
And just really thank you, Brice and Reed, for your presentation and conversation. Thanks everyone for the questions. David Godwin, thank you for that point in the chat. The whole carbon thing is really important. Working with folks in the driftless region of Wisconsin, where I saw Reed last, there's the carbon biodiversity kind of questions are there, and we need to have science to back up, management actions there so that we're not unduly biasing one or the other, and maybe they don't conflict. So we need to dig into that more. So thanks everyone.